Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Indian School of Public Policy Policy Review podcast for the June edition. My name is Shivani Menon. I'm an economics graduate from King's College London, and today's podcast is going to be on India's newest COVID warriors, artificial intelligence bots, and the people behind them. Today, I will be interviewing the creators of two artificial intelligence bots, one on Twitter and the other on WhatsApp, that provide an essential service of matching demand and supply for COVID relief resources like oxygen, hospital beds, plasma, medication, etc. in India. We have with us here today Mr. Utkarsh, one of the co-founders of Introbot AI, a WhatsApp-based artificial intelligence software that helps people find verified COVID resources in real time. He founded Introbot AI alongside Mr. Divyanshanuj. Mr. Utkarsh Roy did his MSc in Computer Science from the University of Toronto. He was the co-founder and CEO of Oh Wow, a mobile-first file-sharing tech startup for the creator economy. Mr. Divyanshanuj graduated from the Birla Institute of Technology and Science in Pilani. He was the co-founder and CEO of Dextra, a community-based startup for the creator economy as well, based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We also have with us here today Mr. Rahul, Raina, and Mr. Naman Gupta, who are the co-creators of the COVID Resource India bot on Twitter that provides similar services. They are graduates of the School of Accelerated Learning in Secunderabad. Mr. Rahul Raina did his Bachelor's of Engineering in Production Engineering and works as a Node.js developer at Linkfields Inn. Mr. Naman Gupta did his Bachelor's of Commerce from Delhi University, his Master's in Computer Applications in Indira Gandhi National University before joining the School of Accelerated Learning. He works as a back-end developer at Everest Engineering. Thank you so much for joining me today for this podcast, and I'd like to begin by thanking our interviewees for their incredible work and commitment to saving lives during the second wave of coronavirus in India. I would like to begin with the first segment, which is just introducing your softwares. It would be great if we could start off by hearing your origin stories. Could we hear from Mr. Utkarsh first, who will talk about Introbot, and then from Mr. Raina, who will talk about COVID Resbot on Twitter?
Sure, Shivani. Wonderful to be here, and glad to be able to help during the second wave of COVID crisis in India. We definitely had no plans of doing this about 4 weeks back. So Divyansh and I have been working on this bot called Introbot, which is basically an AI solution for connecting different kinds of virtual communities and making sure that people help each other out through their needs and through resources. And while we were working on this, we realized that, hey, COVID is here and we could actually do something. So this COVID project started out as an experiment, and we thought that, hey, if we can maybe help about 100 or 200 people in the first few days, then we'll continue building it. And while that was happening, I was down with symptoms myself, so I could feel how bad other COVID-affected families and patients would feel. I mean, it was a terrible experience. And Devansh and I started discussing, and we quickly built up this initial prototype just to see how it works and what we can do. And parallelly, we started building out a database of resources. But as we started sharing in a few of our family and friends group and other WhatsApp groups we were part of, it suddenly blew up. And before we realized, we had served more than 20,000 people in a matter of 2 days. And we could actually see all those chats coming to our screens. Like, people are searching for hospital beds, ambulances, oxygen refills, and multiple other medical related supplies. And that's when we realized that this is something really critical, and we should focus all our energies into this. And that's when we kind of dropped everything from our usual business side of things as a startup, and then we started focusing on the COVID project. And I'm glad to share that over a period of about 3.5 weeks now, we have served more than 750,000 people on the ground. And out of them, about 35,000 people have found it helpful. So we are happy to share that maybe we have saved a couple of thousand lives in the last few weeks. And we are grateful to be in a position to help out people in such a way with use of AI and technology and our skill sets. So super glad and happy to share more of my story.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Mr. Raina, would you like to share your story too?
Yeah, so it started similar. We had no plans of creating this. So me and Naman, we just sat down. We decided that the Twitter is the platform is being used rigorously by people for sharing data or asking for data. So we basically focused on the asking part of it, where people were looking for beds, hospitals, or oxygen cylinders, or medicines, or anything. So we decided to create a bot, the COVID rest bot, which would be triggered when someone tags it in their post and gives it the permission to scan the whole post for keywords like state names or city names and resources like medicine or bed or oxygen, and similarly give out a reply post as a link to another website where they can find all the details they need, from address, phone numbers to quantities and everything. So it was a pretty cool experience. Utkarsh said, their database blew up in one night. Same things happened to us also. The bot got banned for spamming because too many people were requesting it. So the policies are different. So we had to take care of that. So the bot got banned several times in a week. So we had to keep on changing, keep making changes. So it was pretty good experience helping people with the skills that we had developed in last 4 months. I'm not a developer by education or anything. I just decided to start developing this lockdown only. So that was the story behind it.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think something that we have in common with both your stories is that in times of crisis, help comes from the most interesting places. So thank you so much for sharing your stories. With that, I was hoping we could move on to the main segment of our podcast today, the public policy focus section. I was hoping we could draw on your respective expertise to gain some insight into some of the pressing public policy questions concerning the use of artificial intelligence in COVID-19 management, and most specifically in your jobs of matching resources, so matching demand and supply. So my motivation behind this is to highlight the work of non-governmental policy actors such as yourself that do work on the field actively. And this is, I feel, an angle of public policy that is far too often overlooked in the general discourse. And it has some very strong insights to inform public policy and government policy. So that is my main motivation behind this. I think it would have far-reaching consequences for generally government policy design, formulation, implementation, and evaluation afterwards. So that is the angle that I thought I would carry forward. So in the first section of our podcast, I was hoping we could just talk about the nature of the second wave of COVID. So during India's second wave, we've seen there's a very large section of civil society that's ready to help. They're very enthusiastic to help. But in such an uncertain and risky policy environment, good intentions don't always translate into effective action. In this light, the overwhelming success behind both your intelligence softwares comes from a very specific need it addresses, that of matching demand to supply, basic economics. Mr. Gupta, I was hoping you could walk us through how you identified the need for such a specific service.
Okay, so we just went through some we did some study what actually person is searching for. So at time we started people were searching for oxygen in Delhi and something like that. And by that time, many others group like Introbot as well were in the loop with us as well. So we developed the Twitter bot using the same concept of meeting the demands of the people what they are asking for. So at the same time, we are also communicating with other developers to help us providing the data that they have, so we can make a one particular database and provide the data to the person who are in need of that.
That's amazing. So from what I can garner from your response, a sensitivity to the market in general, just keeping your eyes and ears open at all times, and the ability to mobilize on a short-term basis is one of the driving successes behind your projects. And I think that's amazing. Thank you so much. Next, I was hoping to talk to Mr. Roy. Such a form of intelligence software, what it's doing is essentially filling in the gaps created by the shortcomings of the Indian healthcare system during this wave. From your interactions with other policy agents and your experiences on the field, what do you identify some of the causes for these shortcomings, or rather this uneven distribution of resources, to be?
Yeah, great question, Shivani. Let me try to address that from various perspectives. So I don't think it's the lack of governance or policies resulting in what happened. It was more about nobody expecting something like this to happen. So let me take you back to the time, February, March in India. People had completely gone out. They were starting to mingle, go out in crowds, through various places. So nobody anticipated like a big spike of the second wave coming. They thought COVID is over. And I mean, that was fundamentally a discipline problem and a knowledge problem. So people had moved on. And when it started hitting, in a matter of about 1.5 weeks, the cases went from 15,000 to about 3 lakhs, which is 300,000 suddenly. So nobody had that idea of like what to do. The government wasn't ready, hospital bodies weren't ready, doctors weren't ready, even people themselves weren't ready. So everything kind of played together to kind of build up the unfortunate scenario that happened. And we realized that, hey, while a lot of information is floating around in WhatsApp groups, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram stories, nobody was really trying to collate all of them together in a manner that is useful to the people. And that was the gap. And since we all come from startup backgrounds, like we are built to move fast. We are built to kind of make sure that we persist through the ups and downs. And I think having that mindset really helped us mobilize quickly, not just from the technology side, but also from the human capital side, get various initiatives moving and plumbed up together, and talking to multiple networks as well, because we realized that this needs solid implementation skills and not just ideas, because people during that time were running thousands of initiatives. I'm sure Rahul and Naman would agree. There are so many things going on in the ground, but we realized that not many had the discipline to come together and mobilize. Some of them did not have the right skills or the background to do it, even though they had the perfect and the best intentions at heart. So we were just lucky to kind of be in a position where we could utilize all of those different resources, and specifically identifying the gaps to fill. And I can talk more in detail because there's a lot of things to that story, but let me stop here, Shivani, unless you have more questions on this particular angle.
We're doing a few more questions that relate perfectly to what you're talking about. But I think you did mention two things that are very characteristic of some economic features of just basically in times of crises, how unexpected events lead to supply shocks and supply runs, where it's the unexpectedness of it that causes a shortage or just causes an overwhelming of the general healthcare system. And I think you also pointed to something very interesting, which is a leading study in behavioral economics now, which is that of people's mindsets in February and the effect that had on the supply run. So thank you for sharing that with us. In the second section, we will be talking about what Mr. Roy mentioned, the policy environment here and how it's characterized by so much uncertainty and a need for fast-paced adaptability. And what you mentioned, how the nature of tech startups really feeds into that, because it's inherently structured in such a way that this adaptability happens with more ease. So my first question, I thought I could ask Mr. Raina, from your experience developing and deploying these bots, could you describe the policy landscape in general for artificial intelligence operations in India? And do you think, how do you describe this industry to be?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting question to answer, actually. So to begin with, I would say it's quite friendly. It's just like quicksand. The more you try to agitate it, you get stuck more. So as long as the permissions you are asking for are friendly for the users and for the viewers, it's quite easy to manipulate data, to use the data. But as soon as you start asking for more permissions, for example, for our bot, what we were doing, we are posting links to several resources. So there are hurdles, like the link should be certified. There should be SSL certificates for that. So we have to abide by the policy rules. The bot cannot comment simultaneously on so many messages, that is considered spamming. There are rate limitations put up by the different platforms. So we have to abide by all those policies. It is, they are friendly, but also very hectic at the same time when you try to get into more things. So that's the thing. When the uncertainty comes, you have to adapt. There's always an open space for adaptation. So you just have to run your brain through it and adapt according to it.
That's very true. I think you drew a very interesting link between uncertainty and adaptability, about how in an uncertain environment, adaptability follows because it's the need of the hour. And, whether it's non-governmental policy actors, whether it's the government, whether it's, general public, they follow the same thought process. And I think that's one of the strongest uniting factors in the context of a health crisis such as COVID. So thank you for that. I was wondering if anybody else had some insights into the policy landscape for artificial intelligence in India, because I'm sure you're different. You would have had different experiences with the same.
So, Shivani, while I don't have any specifics on the Indian landscape, I can talk about the global landscape a bit because I have closely seen the evolution of AI. So there's an anecdote that I want to share. So when the neural networks were being developed, so I'm talking about deep neural networks and machine learning, as we call it, which is fundamentally AI. That was being developed by Professor Geoffrey Hinton in the same computer science lab in 2011 when I was studying there as well. So that was the origin of these neural networks. And I could see Professor Geoffrey Hinton trying to publish his reports outside to the external world. And it was a very different way of doing AI. And it was not very popular back in 2010, 11, and that time frame. And then he eventually worked with Google and Microsoft and multiple other bigger companies, and his students actually published a lot of papers and could show that how deep neural networks can actually solve for AI. And then Professor Andrew Ng from Stanford, he also joined in the same movement. I mean, he has his own followership in AI and machine learning, and they kind of all combine forces, and that's how I could actually see the industry move forward by decades in a matter of those 5 years, 2011 to 2017. And then now AI and machine learning are very, very common source, and everybody talks about it. And then fast forward a couple of years, so last year I ended up in the same house where Google PageRank was written. So one of my mentors is a direct mentor of Larry Page and Sergey Brin because of the Stanford connection, and we have a lot of friends. And I landed up in the same house. I stayed there for about 3 months, and I learned a lot of interesting things. And then I got to also work on a pro bono basis with people at Google X, which is like the moonshot factory of Google, and they were working on multiple cutting edge AI, machine learning, and quantum computing projects. So there was a lag when, like in the span of 2011 to 2020, where US and Silicon Valley was way ahead of everybody else. But now I could see the changing landscape where even kids in like standard 9th or 10th in India are going through the same AI models and resources, and they can access Google's libraries and so on. So the bridge has, the gap has been bridged, and now everybody knows about it. So I think that's a very positive landscape that has been emerging, and people have been interested in computer science, coding, algorithms, intelligence in general, and that trend is going higher up. So I'm very, very positive and bullish about how things would evolve in the next 5 years, even if it's not from the policy front, but from the technology front.
For sure. I think you said it right. It's a trend, and that means it's an evolutionary process. You start from one end, and where it's not as popular, and as more things are brought out to the front, as more technology is developed, it garners more popularity. So my next question is in the context of Intrabot specifically. because you spoke about how you managed to scale up operations. And I think just in terms of things like estimating numbers in the middle of a crisis is not easy, which makes designing policy for the same also it faces the same constraint. You don't have a solid precedent. So, did you introduce your software in an experimental capacity first? I was hoping you could talk us through that in terms of how you managed to scale up operations very quickly and your decision making processes behind these are the numbers we need to meet in order to take it forward as the next step.
Again, that's a great question. And I think that ties up directly to our backgrounds, both Divyansh's and mine. So Divyansh has been running his own startup before called Dextra, where he kind of built and managed a community of 50,000 professionals, creative professionals essentially. And he was also used to like building software which can scale up pretty quickly. And I have been running my own venture funded startup before, which was called OWOW. And we had more than 200,000 users. And previously, I was with Cisco Systems in US on the team that used to deal with scalable technologies. So I was part of the cloud computing and distributed systems team. So for the last decade, being on the engineering forefront of how computing can scale, we were aware of how it would look like so that we could actually pre-plan the whole journey. And having that mindset, we wanted to make sure we build our product so simply and seamlessly that we wouldn't have the challenge of scaling up as new users came in. So we were using this tool called Airtable as our backend and not really use some of the complex MySQL and like other complex technologies. And that could easily scale up. And we were constantly working with our vendors from the Facebook side of things and also the database side of things to let them know that, hey, we are scaling up quickly and we are getting 300 requests a day. 300 requests a minute, which translated to about 70 to 80,000 requests that we were responding to on a day-to-day basis in the middle of the crisis. So we were aware and we're constantly adapting our backend systems and the infrastructure and the way we have been writing algorithms to adapt to this. So there's a lot of complicated and intrinsic movements that happen which are not visible to the end user, but we were constantly updating it. And finally, we did decide to move to a different kind of database to scale up to a couple of millions. But thankfully, the wave has kind of gone down. So we have seen the number of requests going down as well. So we are happy about that. But we are ready for a third wave and we are working hard to prevent the third wave from coming. But if it happens, we are ready to serve more people.
Thank you so much for your answer. I think we're going to be drawing on some of these concepts moving forward in terms of using artificial intelligence in the preparedness phase of things. How do we prepare ourselves for what we don't know is to come? In the next section of the second segment, I was hoping we could talk about the different stakeholders involved in this, who are the main policy actors here, and how do you facilitate effective coordination? In this light, Mr. Raina, I was hoping you could tell us how central intelligence systems and software, such as the one you have created, rely on databases and actual data, and whether this requirement sort of limits its usage outside of COVID resource allocation in terms of other things. Is the requirement for data, is it an obstacle, if I may put it that way?
Yeah. Again, Shivani, these questions are really good. I have never heard of any questions of this kind. Very good questions. Yeah, these bots, they are heavily dependent, especially the COVID response bot, because all it is doing is taking the data from the post, matching the keywords, and getting the data from the database. So it is heavily dependent on the database. So database plays a very extreme role in that. And to have valid data, we created a lot of things. Like we integrated Twilio calling to have users being called on day-to-day basis. Not users, actually, the vendors were being called on day-to-day basis to be verified that they have this resource, said resource in their whatever they have in the storage or whatever. So that was the main thing about the database that we added afterwards. So database, in general, database has a very important role everywhere. Besides this COVID, let's say if everything settles down, this data still will be very useful. because need of oxygen will never go away. You are going to need oxygen, you are going to need beds, you are going to need medicines. So we can maybe afterwards use all this database to create a new set of AIs that can provide a new set of information. That's how AI works. Like, you just manipulate data, you have data, you just manipulate it in different ways. The only thing is everything must be verified, and to catch attention, to gain attention, to gain traffic, that's the only way. Verification is the only way to do that.
I'm very glad you brought up verification, because that segues perfectly into our next question about how one of the biggest bottlenecks that intrabot and COVID bot addresses is that of verification of leads, because it's not always that these sources still have what they claim to have. In that sense, Mr. Roy, could you talk to us about your driving innovation of what you call a community-based approach?
Sure, Shivani. So we could see that the market shifted through different phases. The first phase was where people did not have any leads. People were forwarding numbers and screenshots and things like that. There was no way to collate them. So we quickly started building our database. And through that effort, we got connected to this organization called COVID Citizens, which wasn't called that when we started out. So both Divyansh and me and a bunch of other startups in the ecosystem, such as WakeFit and Fireside, which is a sister startup of Chingari, which is a popular social media site, Shiro's, Art of Living. So there are multiple organizations that kind of joined forces through a very, very collaborative effort, and came under this umbrella of COVID Citizens. And when we started collecting database and data and building the database, we quickly built up India's one of the largest databases with about 35,000 leads of medical resources in a matter of about 7 to 10 days. But we realized that, hey, building database is not the end goal. Verification is the biggest challenge. So we set out a team of about 350 volunteers who were constantly calling and verifying. The problem was, and that's when we landed in the second phase of the problem, was that the dynamic nature of supplies. So even if a person in, say, Delhi had 10 cylinders of oxygen, that will quickly run out because the demand was almost 100 times the supply. There was no way to constantly understand if they still had the supply or not. So then we put some technology intervention in this case, and through Introbot, we repurposed the bot into being the verification channel as well, so that the bot was constantly asking from people about whether they got request or not, whether the supplier had supplies remaining or not, on both the sides. And we're doing it on thousands of queries that we're receiving on a day-to-day basis. And once we realized that and we fixed that, we could quickly get more and more verified leads. But that brings us to the third phase, where we realized that the number of people who are actually getting help through the bot and the database was less than 10%. So even at that phase, even with the high-end verification that we're doing, and we were the only ones in India, and even now we are the only technology-based solution in India who is doing verification at this scale. We quickly realized that we need to increase the supplier side of things, because this ultimately becomes a marketplace. It's like Uber, but for medical supplies. So we need to make sure that there's enough stream of load balancing happening on the supplier side, so that they're not getting pinged all the time because they have a job to do. They cannot keep responding to calls. And while making sure that the demand side also works well. So with that in mind, we built out a supplier bot. And in this case, Divyansh was working with another team called Brooks ecosystem, essentially. And we built out the supplier bot to make sure we are also on WhatsApp threads with these suppliers pan-India across 600 plus cities. So this made sure that we can make those connections even more effectively without people having to call these people, and while constantly growing the database as well. So it was a three-phased approach. And I think now we have come to a point where we have stabilized the verification patterns, and we have made sure that most of the queries are resolved in a certain way. And going forward, we're looking to integrate a concierge service as well, where there would be human volunteers sitting behind the technology and making sure every person who has come to us for help gets answered through multiple channels. It could be Twitter, it could be our website, it could be our voice communication channel, or it could be through Introbot, which is our WhatsApp bot interface. So it's a massive effort, and it's a community-driven initiative with multiple people and organizations being involved in this whole project.
That's truly fascinating. From what I can garner from what you've said, it seems to follow a very decentralized approach. So I think that's easily one of your driving innovations. And if I could ask you a follow-up question on the same, in terms of how decentralized it is, if you had to draw a counterpart and make it centralized, and such a function, say, be controlled, be a government function, what challenges would you identify in that?
So there are two paths to it. When we started out, it was more of a community-driven initiative where people were acting through their own minds and had their own plans. But as we started coming together, we quickly realized that, hey, we need a central structure to make this happen because there are too many moving parts. And then that's when Divyansh and I both started collaborating very deeply with COVID citizens, and we ultimately became founding members as well, and the people who joined us. So I was fixing the operational bottleneck of COVID citizens as well. So contributing to building the playbooks and the pipelines of how it will scale up as an organization. So in a matter of month, we could actually feel that we kind of started out as a startup, but now we are at a Fortune 5000 company. I mean, the way things are getting operationalized. So while this can start out as a decentralized civic movement with different brains being involved, there has to be a central playbook to make sure that the efforts are being aligned in specific ways and the energies are being used in particular in proper ways, because at the end this is about saving lives. And if we are not doing things in a proper order, then it's like moving chairs in a Titanic, right? I mean, even if you put a lot of effort, we won't go anywhere.
Very true. That's what you said is perfect in terms of how it started off decentralized, but in terms of functions like monitoring and supervision, you still need a centralized outlook. And in terms of, a central view, that's where it really, really holds true. I think sorry, go on.
Yeah, one more line I want to add to that. It's like through this effort, we realize that how our skills and how whoever brings their own skills to the table kind of align with each other. I mean, they're all complementary. So I come from a business and technology background. So I was more into execution. Hey, let's get these things done. Versus there is another person called Hema in our group who is very much focused on the impact side of things, on the strategy side of things. So we could all see the skills coming together and aligning, and that happened organically. Even like partnerships, like it just happened. People were willing to help and come forward and make sure they are serving the community. So it itself was a beautiful project, I would say, aside from the impact we created.
Very sure. Complementarity of skills is very important. I think that outlook is also what we're trying to show here, that in terms of achieving effective policy outcomes, it's not just government policy. It's also such valuable work being done by non-governmental policy agents such as yourselves. So that's very true. Thank you for sharing. In our final section for this segment, I think this is where the most important, because this is where we really draw from your experiences to answer some of the questions regarding what does the future of artificial intelligence look like in COVID management. So the World Health Organization has identified 6 distinctive phases of the evolution of a viral outbreak. So it starts off with investigation, moves on to recognition, initiation, acceleration, deceleration, and preparation. So we're currently in the acceleration phase, where AI is being used in a COVID resource matching capacity, and soon moving towards deceleration, hopefully. Looking forward to the deceleration phase, Mr. Raina, do you think the prospects of artificial intelligence here look promising in terms of, do you think artificial intelligence could accelerate like development of maybe, medical treatment, or in terms of something like vaccine matching, because there seems to be a vaccine shortage too. Do you think the prospects of AI look promising?
Yes, definitely. AI is a very powerful tool, I would say. You can do a lot of things with AI, but apart from other things, let's say the health is the most important thing a human being has. So, seeing like we hear news here and there that AI is doing this, AI is doing that, but personally looking at it, working with people who are developing this thing, let's say Utkarsh is working on Interpart. The database is same. COVID response is also using the same data. So the prospect looks very bright to me. I think AI will be more in use in future for creating more solutions in healthcare. And for the shortage of vaccine that you said, that it's similar to the current situation, right? There was shortage of supplies. Actually, there were supplies, but the shortage was communication. That gap was filled by the AI. So similarly, if let's say there are more vaccines coming in, people wouldn't know that we have these vaccines, or who is selling these vaccines, where are these vaccines available. Maybe we can modify the bots again. Like Utkarsh said, they just added verification to their bot. So suddenly it also became a verification bot. Similarly, we can do for vaccine. Instead of just giving out the details and data about the medicines, beds, oxygens, etc., we can start doing it with vaccines as well. As soon as more vendors come in, more vaccines come in. So I guess the AI would be filling the gap between acknowledgement and communication with public and the government. And I think the prospect for the future use is very high.
I think you put it very well. I like that one statement. It does the job of filling the gap between acknowledgement and communication, because like you rightly said, it's very often not a shortage of supply; it's a shortage of communicating where the supply lies. So, thank you so much for sharing. Something I personally find most interesting, and what I also believe will be the hardest to implement, would be the usage of such intelligent software in the preparedness phase. So once we have decelerated and moving forward into thinking, how do we prevent this uneven distribution from recurring? How do you think, in terms of something like data sharing and in terms of data synthesis? I'm guessing AI would face slightly a larger amount of hesitancy in that sense, because of cybersecurity concerns, in terms of privacy concerns, because that's something that the government has raised on more than one occasion. So what do you think in terms of the preparedness phase? What do the prospects of AI look like here? I think it'd be great if you could both contribute to this question. We can start with Mr. Roy, maybe.
Sure. AI will come handy and very, very useful across all the different stages. From prevention to cure, right? It's not a question of A versus B. It's a question of how we can manage all the different stages of the pipeline. Having said that, what I realized as part of the whole 1 month experience of battling COVID is AI and data were never the bottleneck. It were the humans who were coming into play, and the emotions and the egos. And everybody thinks that they own this piece of data or access to tools or networks that they're not willing to share with other people. And that is exactly why technology advancement is being stopped. But we could see a different perspective when COVID hit. Everybody was so open to sharing the data, the skills, resources, time, networks in such a way that everything could be moved fast. So we built out this massive pan-India supply database of 40,000 plus leads in a matter of 10 days. And we have served more than 750,000 people. We are serving 600 plus cities. So and during this process, we have partnered with almost 35 plus organizations. That is basically 2 partnerships a day. Now, if you talk about normal times, to build up this kind of effort would take almost 1.5 years. At this level. So I was wondering what has changed. And I was discussing with the team and with Divyansh, and the conclusion we came to was that now everybody's focus is on saving lives. So people open themselves up. If this could happen in a regular circumstances, I think the humanity would advance in multiple ways, and AI and data could be the back end of this whole effort. The front end being humans themselves. So, so I think that's what I feel about it. I just wish that we can continue some of these efforts going forward, not just in COVID times.
That's very true. I think you said it right. It's like, as this podcast is titled, it's India's newest COVID warriors, AI bots, and the people behind them. So the people, that you're very true, that they hold the strongest prospects moving forward. Mr. Raina, I was wondering if you had anything to share on the same.
Yeah, I would just say that while sharing the, like Utkarsh already has highlighted, that we have a huge amount of data of people with us. We have their phone numbers, we have their addresses, we have so many things. So while sharing this data with further agencies, we need to have some more third-party policies, I would say, to prevent any sort of misuse. So I think that would be very, very important in case of privacy, as well as having verified data. So establishing a few more policies while sharing the data. Like I said, when we created the bot, we faced issues while creating the bot due to the policies, but those are necessary things that prevent misuses. So I think we should focus on that as well while this pandemic is, let's hope it keeps on decelerating. We have this huge data with us. We should also focus on the prevention of the misuse of this data. So
Right.
that's from my side. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's very true. Preventing misuse, you point towards something very pressing in AI, which is the concept of regulation. These policies, like you said, they might slow, if not slow down, be an obstacle in operations, but at the same time, they're there for a reason. And the fact that acknowledging that and finding ways to work around these constraints, or rather work with them, not around them, work with them, is the key to having a successful software. Finally, I think to wrap it all up, I have a very broad question that I think would be great answered by the two of you. What, in your opinion, looks like the most promising way, either in times of a health crisis like COVID or outside, to integrate artificial intelligence into the Indian healthcare system? And I say Indian here because I would assume that a lot of the implications of AI would vary from, say, a country like the US or the UK, and compared to a country like India, where the prospects of AI look very different. So what do you think is the most promising way to integrate it, in all constraints considered?
I think AI will be very helpful. That's my notion from the beginning when I started coding, which was not too long ago. It's just 4 months ago. So what I would say, let's take for example, in India itself, there are more than 7 to 8 strains of just COVID virus. More than 7 strains, I guess, right now. So what AI has, it is the capability to compare data. So comparing different data, what strain, how are we differentiating these strains even? How are we doing it? So maybe to accelerate those processes, maybe there are more than 20 strains. We don't know because we are not able to just differentiate it. Maybe AI can help in that as well. In the same time, the database plays the important role. Maybe from the database that big institutes like Serum or Dr. Reddy's, who is in Russia. So if they collaborate a little bit, start sharing their little tips and tricks of creating the doses, creating the vaccines, maybe we can feed that data to AI to cross-check with the strains and give us a new chemical composition that can create new vaccines for different strains. So that's my aspect on this AI thing.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Mr. Roy?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and I would like to take a step back and give some broad context. The context here being that people are divided into multiple communities right now. So we have community of doctors, we have community of innovators in the form of engineers and technologists and scientists and so on. And we have a community of policymakers. And then we have a community of business people who can actually get things done. So the challenge here is that none of these communities are talking to each other right now. All of them live in their own silos, and all of them think that they are the forefront of the world and they are the center of the universe, which is not true, because we all need each one of us. It should be a collaborative effort. So I think that the best way to solve this, and the way we think of it within Introbot, is that we need to make communities more efficient and make sure that communities and cohorts and any sort of groups of human beings should talk to each other and leverage each other's strengths. So going forward, if only the medical community could talk to the business community, in turn they could talk to the policy community, and we could all combine our strengths to come up with solutions, I think we can not only cure and solve for these problems globally, but also prevent many of these going forward. So I think we just need to acknowledge that there are other people who exist, who are better than us in a lot of different ways, and just reaching out for help. I think we're not doing that right now well enough. I think that's the biggest gap. It's not the technology that's stopping us; it's the mindsets.
That's very insightful. I think the fact that the two of you had quite different answers to this question just shows how the prospects are widespread. From Mr. Raina, we heard of more medical research oriented things in terms of strain identification and data comparison. And from Mr. Roy, we heard about how it acts as an integrating framework between different sections of community. And both of these, in terms of policy being reinforced by research, as well as policy having to be intersectional and like bringing together so many different agents, AI seems to have a very promising take. Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of this podcast. It's been amazing talking to you all. It's been a great discussion. And once again, I would like to thank you for your commitment to saving lives during the second wave. It's been an honor to speak to you all. Thank you.